Hello and welcome to Rudaw. I'm Roj Eli Zalla in Washington, D.C. With ISIS caliphate nearly being erased from the map, what does the future for Syria, what does the future hold for Syria, northeast Syria particularly, and will the end of ISIS bring a change into terrorism? In another word, is the Sunni jihadism changing? My guest this week thinks so. I'm joined by Hassan Hassan, director of the Nonstate Actors Program at the Center for Global Studies. Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's start with the last stronghold of ISIS. There were a lot of ISIS fighters that many, including the SDF forces on the ground and also Americans, did not expect that many ISIS fighters being there. How's the fight so far going, and why was there not this accurate number of how many fighters were there, or even, at least close to a accurate number of the fighters?
Right. Well, I think, as you said, nobody expected this many people to stay until the end, until that last piece of land at the edges of the Euphrates River between Iraq and Syria. I think for a long time there was no visibility for the U.S.-led coalition about this area. They thought this was sort of the end of ISIS. ISIS is already finished after Raqqa, so there's the final battle in this these rural parts of Deir ez-Zor. But ISIS kept going down south until the end, and we suddenly see all these large numbers of ISIS members and ISIS families all stranded in that last piece of land.
So it looks like ISIS has a very complicated system of tunnels in Baghouz particularly. Right. Does that suggest that even before the start of the operation against ISIS kind of had a plan for, okay, Baghouz is going to be our last stronghold, this is where we're going to be fighting our last fight?
Well, so we didn't know for a while. I think it wasn't clear for ISIS if Baghouz would be the last one, because the battle, when it started from southern Hasaka all to Deir ez-Zor, along the Khabur river, there were also other attacks from Baghouz, from the other side. There was also talk about Iraqi forces coming in from Qa'im into Iraq to fight there. So I don't think ISIS knew that Baghouz would be the last stand, but they prepared for this sort of scenario in different areas. So if it wasn't Baghouz, it would have been probably either Hajin or Susa or Shafa near Baghouz, these small or the main towns in that little area. So I think it would have been somewhere else. Baghouz is a bit tricky because of the river, because of the borders, because of the some kind of difficult terrain in that area.
Right, and Hassan, so the million-dollar question, the question that almost everyone is asking is that, right, is ISIS over, or will we see ISIS 2.0?
Right. So ISIS as a caliphate, as an organization that holds territory, is over. I don't think ISIS will hold territory again, not just because they cannot hold territory. I think because the kind of the chatter within ISIS and within kind of people, or among people who are close to ISIS or are in touch with ISIS, is that the organization does not want to hold territory because of what happened to them over the past few years. So the next phase for them is insurgency. Is to go underground and start these tactics that we came to know in Iraq, like in Kirkuk and Salah ad-Din and so on and so forth. These are tactics that ISIS used before successfully and effectively to regroup and bring itself back from the ashes and from total defeat into the rise that we saw in 2014. So the next phase is insurgency. I don't think we should be worrying too much about kind of another caliphate for the next few years in the same way we saw over the past few years. And that's a significant milestone for everyone, obviously, because ISIS not holding territory means they can no longer indoctrinate mass numbers of people. They cannot make massive they don't have access to massive resources and sources of money and income, and they can't use territory for them to learn and develop tactics and attack and plan and so on and so forth. So they're acting now as an underground organization, still very dangerous, and it will be more and more dangerous in the future as it regroups and as it plants its networks here and there, and will come back.
So that's really interesting, the lose of territory and how that might impact the next phase of terrorism in the Middle East and in the Islamic or Muslim world. But I want to, I'll come back to that point, but I want to also talk about your recent article in which you're arguing that Sunni jihadism is changing. Well, first, help us understand, what is the change? What are some of the changes that is taking place?
So it was a long article, so I'll try to kind of summarize it. So what happened, in my opinion, over the past 8 years, like since 2008, 2011 until now, is that we started to see jihadis and jihadi groups across the region, Sunni jihadi groups, being submerged in local struggles and local conflicts in Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and so on and so forth, and Afghanistan, obviously. And because because their heavy involvement in local struggles, that changed jihadis, because they have now priorities. Their enemy is local. Their enemy is in Syria is Bashar Assad, and their enemy in Libya was Gaddafi, and then after that, other organizations in those areas. And that means the way they think about their ideology is no longer the same as Osama bin Laden thought and did in the 90s and early 2000s, when his organization at the time, before Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, and before the war in Iraq, was a vanguard movement, meaning it's all about kind of this elite force, a bunch of individuals who were thinking about attacking and moving the jihad from Afghanistan against the Soviets, into a fight against the United States. But they didn't have an army, they didn't have grassroots support. They were just individuals that we only heard about from TV and from these cassettes and videos early on. So the situation is different, and now because of these struggles on the ground, you started to see in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, jihadis moving away from the international jihadism, and even moving from suicide bombing and takfir, excommunication, into becoming more closer to the people and trying to reflect their demands on the ground.
So basically, what you're saying is that Sunni jihadists are now more focused on the local fights.
That's right.
Not the fight with other countries. But what does that do to for example, the Sunni jihadist groups in Syria and their relationship with their sister organizations outside of Syria, and their connection to this whole idea of ummah and resurrecting the Islamic rule over, not just one particular local area, but to multiple places.
Okay. So this whole thing is about tactics. Before, Osama bin Laden wanted a global struggle, and he was preaching about the fight against the far enemy, the head of the snake, as he called it, America and other countries in the West, and so on and so forth. So he directed his effort towards outside enemies. But now, even Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, and even Al-Qaeda offshoots, people who branched out of Al-Qaeda, they are not thinking the same way. They say, our fight against the West is a waste of time. We have more priorities in Iraq, in Syria, elsewhere. We're fighting a fight for our countries. So they are focused on their countries these days, but they see the sum of all these parts. So if you succeed in Libya, succeed in Iraq, and succeed in Syria and Yemen, collectively you're serving one goal, which is the ummah, the kind of the popularization of this idea of jihad elsewhere. So my thesis was, if you compare between, say, extremism among Shia groups and extremism among Sunni groups, the difference is that Sunnis have the three pillars that distinguish them from Shia groups. First, international jihad, international terrorism, and suicide bombing, the use of excessive suicide bombing, and the third one is takfir, or excommunication. So for all these three pillars has started to change since 2011, where when we saw, for example, just to give you one example, Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as it's known now, has an internal instruction telling its own rank and file and leaders to avoid and refrain from excessive use of suicide bombing. He said, don't use suicide bombing as much as you can. Only in front lines if you need to, but avoid civilian killings and so on and so forth. That's the instruction. They didn't abandon suicide bombing, but they reduced it to a minimum. That's why they came up with another term or another tactic, enghimasi. So they attack the enemy, and if they come back alive, then that's preferable for them. But if they die, then it's part of the.
So in enghimasi, they go with the intent of defeating the enemy. If that means getting myself killed, that's okay. But if I can come back, then bravo.
Exactly. So they go. There's an extra risk, obviously. Enghimasi means you become immersed, mungamis, in your enemies, deep behind the enemy lines, or in the front lines. So there's a high risk of you being killed in the battle. You're not just shooting from afar. So that's the difference between enghimasi and regular fighting. But also, it's not the same as suicide bombing. Suicide bombing back in Iraq was a person signs up to become a suicide bomber. So he wants to sit down, doesn't do anything. He wants to be sent in a vehicle, drive behind a steer, and blow himself up, and that's it. It's a very shortcut to paradise for him.
In his
mentality,
right? So this change that you're saying that is taking place, I think there's a lot more other questions around it. Well, first of all, why is this tactical change?
Like I said, it's because of what happened in 2011. The world around them changed. Mm-hmm. You know, even Osama bin Laden, when he was writing his diary in 2011 before he was killed, he was thinking about how Al-Qaeda should adapt to the new realities in the Middle East. These are now popular uprisings across the world, across the region, where the people that they wanted to popularize the jihad among them are rising up against these regimes that Osama bin Laden wanted to topple at some point. So the people are changing and toppling regimes better than his idea of like going after the United States and weakening the United States, and then these regimes will fall apart. No, the people have risen up. The people have the awareness to go up. So that's they started to get closer to the people, because they thought the best way to lead the masses, lead the people, is by reflecting their demands and popular aspirations, political aspirations in those countries. But at the same time, because of the fighting that followed these uprisings in countries like Libya, Yemen, and Syria, the jihadis wanted to align themselves with other groups in Syria, like with Ahrar al-Sham, with other groups in Libya, with the tribes and so on and so forth. With the tribes and other Islamist organizations and non-Islamist organizations. Same thing in Libya. So their tactics changed because they wanted to be part of this upheaval that happened across the Middle East. So they were forced to it, and they adapted to a new reality in the Middle East.
And that new reality, of course, sometimes it was also to hijack the legitimate uprising against the dictatorships, the oppressions that they had there. So from what I hear so far, you're saying that the three major changes. One is that they will, I forgot the first one, but
international jihad.
International jihad, exactly.
Bombing.
So they no longer focus on international jihad. They're reducing their suicide bombing, and they refrain from takfiring others or excommunicating the others.
Yeah, less than before.
Less than before.
So international jihadism, for example, you have two examples. Jabhat al-Nusra's leader in Syria, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, now the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's leader, told Al Jazeera directly that we are not going to allow Syria to become a launch pad for attacks against the West. So he was basically saying, I'm not going to allow any jihadi to plan attacks against the West from Syria. That is a big change. The same statement came out of Libya. The jihadis in Libya, the Al-Qaeda in Libya, also said they part of their conversation with the tribes and delegates from society there, is that we will no longer, use Yemen to launch attacks outside. That's a big deal because Al-Qaeda in Yemen or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was seen once as the most important critical branch of Al-Qaeda because of its international involvement in international terrorism. So these are all changes. That doesn't mean at all that jihadism are becoming less of a problem. In fact, they're becoming more of a problem because now you have to deal with how to prevent them from infiltrating these societies, from becoming more embedded with other groups, embedded with their communities. They're becoming harder to detect, harder to extricate. Because when ISIS took over Mosul and Raqqa and stuff like that, it was easy. You can just amass armies around Mosul and so on and so forth, attack Mosul and so on. That's the end of it because there's an address. For Nusra, you can see the complication now in Idlib. How do you deal with Nusra now that it controls Idlib, but it's not really the only force there? It works with others. There's a government there that established by them, but they appoint other individuals to lead them. Turkey now is talking with Russia to try to do something about it. Turkey doesn't want the Assad regime to go and attack Idlib, and Russia is concerned about these jihadis in that area and controlling and so on and so forth. So it's becoming harder.
Right, and so this tactical change also that they're no longer focusing on international jihadism or suicide bombing, decreasing that. What does that do to the relationship between the jihadi group and the populace and the people around them? Does that kind of make them? Is there a fight for legitimacy in this?
Yes, absolutely. That's the central thing. So. For ISIS, and this whole thing is about legitimacy. It's about what they call hadana shabi, or the popular
acceptance.
Right. And for ISIS, they sort of drifted away from this. They said this whole idea of popular acceptance is a waste of time. You control an area, you take over these people, and you make them fall in line. For Nusra and Al-Qaeda, they think that their idea has been vindicated because ISIS tried this and failed. Look at the Sunni towns, they say, from Mosul to Raqqa to Aleppo, all these different areas, even though ISIS didn't take Aleppo, but all these different areas have been decimated. And that's why. That's the reason for that is that ISIS brought destruction to Sunni areas across Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, and Libya. So they say our policy, the other jihadis, the Al-Qaeda, says no. Our approach, that patient, long-term, game, is working better. Now, I don't think that's accurate. I think Al-Qaeda approach and ISIS approach should be seen as two problems coming from two sources, and they will continue both competing for the legitimacy, international legitimacy of jihad, being the leaders of global jihad. One is saying I'm going to do it by force, another one do it by diplomacy and popular diplomacy, by working with the public. And I think you have to always see them as added to each other. They're not fighting each other. They're not taking space from each other. Both of them are carving out a new space for them, and together they are a major threat for our societies and for the West.
So in this case, before it was more or less it was one problem. Now it's two problems.
Exactly, even more. Like, so if you think about over the past 18 years since this war on terror started by the United States, what do we have today? We have started with a bunch of individuals led by Osama bin Laden, and now we have a much larger Al-Qaeda that has places and strongholds everywhere in the region, right? And in addition to Al-Qaeda, we have ISIS, and in addition to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, we have groups like Ahrar Sham and other jihadis who are, they have a different approach, less crazy, let's say, than these two groups. And then on the top of all those, you have militant organizations, Shia organizations in Iraq, elsewhere, who are also crossing countries from one country to another to fight a war. They call it a jihad. They call it jihad. They call themselves mujahideen. They have jihadi fatwas and so on and so forth to allow Shia individuals live in Pakistan, live in Afghanistan to go and fight in Syria and form in these militias. What's going to happen to them in the future?
Right.
They're going to add to this instability in the Middle East.
Right. So with the and then with ISIS's devastating defeat, is there? Do you see that ISIS is probably going to be taking some lessons from the other jihadis or the other school of how to conduct jihad in this case? Do we expect less of ISIS suicide bombing in the next phase of the ISIS's insurgency, or is that something that ISIS will likely to keep continue to cause damage that will still say I'm still here?
That's right. So that's a good question, because in my assessment, my prediction is that the change, there would be a change within ISIS, but the change is not going to be so much ideological. It will be more about the focus, what they're going to focus in the future. And I think you have to see ISIS in historical context. ISIS started as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but it was in Iraq, it was kind of focused on Iraq from 2003-04 all the way to 2014. It was mostly Iraqi organization. 2013-14, right. And then from 2013 and 14 they became more this international organization. So from 2014 until 2016 and 17, probably until now, ISIS is focused on this attack in the West and lashing out and blowing things up and doing terrorism in Western countries, in Europe and elsewhere, right? I think that's an exception in their history. I think they will go back to the old history of focusing locally, but this time not just on Iraq. They're going to be local in Afghanistan, local in Iraq, local in Syria, local in Libya, local in Yemen, and together their idea is like Al-Qaeda, but with an Islamic State name, or with a caliphate. Mm-hmm. They consider this as a caliphate. So their focus in the next year will be how to grow roots in the region rather than in the West. So they're going to become less international, but more than just an Iraqi organization. Mm-hmm. And that's a balance. I think that ISIS will take in the future. That's my assessment of where they're going.
Right. And where do the women that have left Baghouz, what role do they play? Because from what the reports that we see, many of them still harbor very, very extremist views. That's of course, this is not all. There are some who are also, at least claim they've been victimized, or they were victims of being, misled into the group or forced into the group. But many of them still harbor very extremist views, and yet some of them haven't committed a crime. It's even difficult for governments to prosecute them when they haven't committed a crime. But it from the reports that we've seen on multiple TVs, and Rudaw had interviewed quite a few, where they're saying now their mission is to train their children to become the next jihadis.
Yes. So that's a major problem that the world will have to grapple with for many years to come, because the young children, the women, and so on and so forth, the leftovers of the caliphate will have a high risk of becoming the next generation of ISIS. The problem is it's not guaranteed that there will be a second generation of ISIS. It will really depend on how we deal with them. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think all these different countries in Europe and elsewhere have to take back the people from their nationality, from their countries, and deal with them in the small numbers that they have, instead of Iraq and Syria and the SDF and the rest deal with this big problem on their own. You know, how much, whatever money you give them, that's not gonna. They don't have the manpower. I know first account of how difficult it for them to process civilians from their resort, my own family, and then how they go to camps and how long it takes them to get them out of the camps because they prove to be just civilians. And then you have to deal with the ISIS ones and how to prove that one is ISIS and it's not ISIS. This is a problem on a much larger scale than we've ever seen. Not in Iraq, not in Afghanistan, because in Afghanistan we had tens of thousands of people who returned from Afghanistan, but never controlled by one group that systematically indoctrinated and governed an area the size of Great Britain within over 5 years. Think about it. This is 5 years. This is as long as the Taliban ruled Afghanistan before they were kicked out of Afghanistan. This is a long time for someone to grow without education, to grow up in these areas, even if they're not exposed to ISIS ideology, just by being not exposed to proper education, by living under this caliphate for so long. It just needs a real international effort. I think the effort should be bigger than the fight, the physical fight, because you need to know how to establish programs to deal with every and each individual and with children, and know how to get them out of this psyche, because that psyche will contribute to the cycle of violence that we'll see over the next generation. And I think it will take us probably another generation to properly grasp what happened over the past 5 years, not just in those areas, but what happened to the Yazidis, what happened to the Kurds, what happened between the Shia and the Sunni. These tensions are not going to go away. People are going to blame these people who live there, whether because they were contributed or just because guilt by association. So there's a huge civilizational project that needs to happen if we want to kind of break that cycle.
So if it looks like European countries and several other countries, there is, to say that, there's a lack of willingness to take these ISIS fighters or the women, and I understand that you're saying there has to be burden sharing. There has to be a really good effort to, larger than the physical effort to destroy the caliphate, is to deal with the remnants of the caliphate. But if that doesn't happen, I think that's a question on a lot of people's mind, at least back in Iraq and Syria. If that doesn't happen, if that rehabilitation program doesn't happen, what, ignoring these women and children, what are some of the likely outcomes that we might be seeing if they're left? The question is, we don't know. That's the big unknown in this thing, because ISIS knew how to weaponize women. They know, for example, a woman does not have to be a fighter to be useful to ISIS. They can be just delivering messages. They can be just doing IEDs, planting IEDs somewhere and blowing up things. She doesn't have to fight. She doesn't have to kill herself. She doesn't have to put herself at risk. So we don't know how much they know, these people, and unless you engage them in a way that at least you start to realize what's happening. You need to have eyes on where these people are going and what's happening to them. If you, as Britain or Holland or Australia, would just say, I have nothing to do with these people, I'm going to just close my borders and forget about them, where are they going to go? They're going to probably, there's so much corruption, a lot of the useful ones, the most important ones will leave, or probably already, in my opinion, the most essential ones have already left. It's easy for them to smuggle themselves out, to get themselves out early on. And they leave people who are willing to fight until then. They are just fighters. They're not essential parts of ISIS. So there are risks of them slipping away somewhere and going to another insurgency, another area to replenish, to increase the insurgency and intensify it in other places. So the other thing is, there are some obvious reasons why some of the European countries are reluctant to take their citizens back to their countries. But help us understand what's this reluctance in Europe coming from? Why, if a fighter is a British citizen or a Dutch citizen, they were radicalized in their land before going to Syria.
Exactly.
So it's not. I mean, it's not like they were.
It's not our problem.
It's
in Syria and Iraq.
right. It's a Dutch citizen who came here, committed a crime, and now he's being arrested or she's being arrested. Now
Right.
it's the mother country's problem to deal with.
Exactly.
But yet there is a reluctance. Help us understand why.
Well, I talked to officials from a lot of those countries, and one thing is they don't know how to deal with these returnees. They think that they're not going to change their mind. They will always be radical. If they know that they can de-radicalize them, then they probably bring them back. They have the resources. I think they have the appetite to try and change their mind. But they believe that they're not reconcilable. And the second reason is because the legal systems in these countries are not equipped to deal with a problem like that. It's not like Guantanamo where you just lock them away and don't deal with them. So these countries, they find themselves in a position where they might get these people back, and they can't establish evidence to prove that these people were fighters or were dangerous people. They could be just going there and they were victims, or at least that's what they claim. That's why these fighters now telling all these TV channels that we were cooks or housewives and so on and so forth, because they want to challenge the evidence. When they go back to their countries, they can say, "Oh, I wasn't really beheading people. I wasn't a fighter. I wasn't enslaving Yazidis and so on and so forth. I was just someone locked up there. I'm so on and so forth." So that will reduce their sentence from, say, 10 years, 12 years into 3 years. And 3 years is a very short period of time for them to spend there and then get out in society and continue their work through radicalization, through thinking like that. ISIS would prefer something like that.
Right. Allow me to inform our Kurdish viewers of the topic. I'll come back and probably ask some questions on the remnants of ISIS. But
Sure.
بیسەران و بینەرانی ڕووداو لەگەڵ حەسەن حەسەن بەڕێوەبەری پرۆگرامی لێکۆڵینەوە لە گروپە چەکدارە نادەوڵەتیەکان لە سنتەری سیاسەتی جیهانی یان سنتەری لێکۆڵینەوە لە سیاسەتی جیهانی گفتوگۆ لەسەر کێشەی داعش مانەوەی ئەو ژمارە چەکداری داعش کە لە باغۆز و لەو ناوچەیە ماونەتەوە هەروەها باس لە تێزێکی حەسەن حەسەن دەکەین کە تێیدا دەڵێت گروپە جیهادیە ئیسلامیەکان سێ گۆڕانکاری گەورە بەسەریاندا دێت. یەک لەوانە ئەوەیە کە چی دیکە تەرکیز ناکەنە سەر هێرشکردنی هێرشی نێودەوڵەتی ئەنجام نادن، ڕێژەی خۆتەقانەوەیان کەمتر دەکەنەوە. ئەم مانایەوە نییە کە ئەنجامی نادن بەڵام کەمتری دەکەنەوە و هەروەها تەرکیزیان زیاتر لەسەر کێشەی ناوخۆیی دەبێت وەک لە کێشەی جیهانی. و سێەم گۆڕانکاری بە بۆچوونی حەسەن حەسەنەوەیە کە کەمتر تەرکیز دەکەنە سەر تەکفیرکردنی خەڵکی دیکە. هۆکاری ئەم گۆڕانە تاکتیکی ئەم گۆڕانە تاکتیکیانەی کە گروپە جیهادیەکان دەستیان پێکردویان لە ماوەی ڕاپردووە بینیمانە حەسەن حەسەن تاتوی هۆکارانە دەکات و هەروەها کاردانەوەی ئەم گۆڕانە لەسەر داعشی دەبێت. داعش ئێستا کە چی دیکە خلافەتی نەماوە دەچێتە قۆناغێکی نوێەوە، مانایەوە نییە کە بە تەوابوونی خلافەتی داعشیش تەواو بووە. بە بۆچوونی زۆربەی شرۆڤەکاران داعش لەمە دووە بە شەڕی گەریلایی بەردەوام دەبێت. بەڵام ئایا داعش دەرسێک لەو گۆڕانکاریە وەردەگرێت کە گروپە جیهادیەکانی دیکە ئەنجامیان داوە، چونکە بە ئەوەی کە داعش ئەنجامیدا جاتر تەرکیزکردن لەسەر هێرشی نێودەوڵەتی بوو، هەروەها ڕاگررتنی یان دەست بە سەراگررتنی ناوچە بوو. بەڵام ئەمە داعش تێدا سەرکەوتو نەبوو. ئێستا لە قۆناغی دووەم داعش چی فێر دەبێت؟ ئایا چۆن دەکرێت مامەڵە لەگەڵ ئەو چەکدارانەی داعش و ئەو ماوەی داعشدا بکرێت. So thank you so much for giving us that short break time for our Kurdish viewers. But you're focusing on non-state actors, and Syrian civil war has been a fertile ground for so many different non-state actors. One thing is that we see is, as you were just talking about before I was taking that break, one thing that we see is that ISIS is probably the first Islamic terrorist group that has recruited that many women. We've seen other Islamic terrorist groups recruiting women in Chechnya and other places, but ISIS had a very large number. But then on the other side of the conflict being between ISIS and the Syrian Democratic Forces, Syrian Democratic Forces has been able to recruit, in the Kurdish history, probably the largest number of Kurdish women. So is women participating in this kind of conflict, is this particular to Syrian civil war, or is this a new trend in the non-state actors that we see?
So we saw on the Syrian regime side, there are some women involved in the fight early on in the fight. But ISIS was the first among the anti-Assad forces that started recruiting women and so on and so forth, like for police in Raqqa, the Khansa group, and so on and so forth, other kind of use them in different ones in administration and the rest. And then also, obviously, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the YPG before, also recruited women. Obviously, different projects, different thinking about role of women. One is liberation, and one is really use them for tactical reasons. ISIS, as in the way they governed, sometimes, which is strange, that some women found themselves. They have at least some role in a society like Eastern Syria, which is a very tribal society. There's a bit more than the norm, because obviously that's not a positive thing, because ISIS used them to for doing harm and so on and so forth. But the Sharia, in that sense, allowed them to have that dangerous role in Eastern Syria. It's a really huge contrast, and that's really that's why I advocate for making this Syrian Democratic Forces a success story, because it still has problems, because it doesn't fully represent the locus is still dominated by the YPG, but it's better than the rest of the actors in
other
Syria.
options that we have.
Yeah, because it's less corrupt than the Syrian regime, for example. They are more liberal, sort of, in the way they treat women and the way they deal with civil cases and so on and so forth. So that, if that model is successful, imagine what we'll do for extremism, but not just for extremism, for the conservative societies in Eastern Syria. Because now women Arab women who got involved in the SDF now have roles. They can see their peers and colleagues in the Syrian Democratic Forces doing things, and that is empowering women a little bit. It's still war zone, so it's not really perfect, but it's it could be something in the future in that area, and this is something we saw in Iraq as well. Obviously, Iraqi women, but not on the same scale. This is a war that the Syrian Democratic Forces, the YPG especially, or the YPG, wanted to mobilize every and each person in that area to fight and build a statelet sort of in Eastern Syria, and that's what I think that's a big hope for Eastern Syria for many reasons. That's why it's really worth building on.
Right, and my intention by far was not to compare the SDF, the role the women play in the SDF, of course, and but
it's a contrast.
It is a contrast. It's a contrast. In Iraq, when Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, for example, was around, he would try to shame men into joining the Al-Qaeda by having women.
Yes.
There's a famous quote where he says, "Is it not a shame for our men that you're not carrying out attacks when our women are carrying out attacks?"
Yes.
In Chechnya, the same kind of way, there was women in the Russian narrative and also the Chechen terrorist group or Islamist groups narrative that were used. But from what you're saying is that in the Syrian Democratic Forces case, the fight that they're conducting is not just to defeat ISIS, the physical caliphate, but they're having this open society, or they're trying to assign roles to everyone in a society. That's a way to fight the ideology in the conservative society.
Yes, absolutely. So And that's an important fight. That's what really the most important fight next is, to establish a model for Eastern Syria. And whether you're talking about politics or religion or society, that model needs to be improved and presented as a positive model, a model that followed the establishment of the so-called caliphate. So it's like I said, it's not perfect. There are still problems, and that's why, for example, Turkey is not happy with it, because they think it's a PKK force, and I think there's room for improving that sort of politics, dealing with improving that the Syrian Democratic Forces is a reflection of the local dynamics in Raqqa, in Deir ez-Zor, in Hasaka, and Qamishli, and Aleppo, and those areas. I think there's a chance to sort of deal with that. Like I said, this is not just about politics, because that part of Syria, the only way, in my opinion, for it to recover and be stabilized in the future is to not be controlled by Bashar al-Assad, and be presented as a decentralized model where people govern themselves, even if eventually they're obviously linked to the Syrian government and they become part of Syria. They have to be part of Syria. They shouldn't be separated and partitioned, because that doesn't work. It has to be linked to Syria. It's already linked, but it has to be improved to become self-governing a body, in that sense, where you delegate much of the power to the locals to govern themselves. But you need to hold their hands for now to kind of improve their capacity, build capacity, and so on and so forth, until they become able to defend themselves against ISIS, but also to govern these areas. And then the other reason for improving that is, like I said again, is this society after ISIS is decimated, tribal society, all willing to give every individual the room for operating and for doing something, and women have a role to play there, and that's why I think there is a huge effort that needs to go to make sure that women can have their role in that society, because now it's no longer a luxury. It's no longer about improving the rate of women participation. That society needs women and needs men to rebuild itself.
Right. I think I have time for one more last question, but and I would like to jump over to the Iraqi side for this one, about so ISIS now going into this insurgency phase, and we've seen in the past that they're the most active in the disputed areas, Diyala, Kirkuk, those areas. Now that the ISIS going into an insurgency phase, they might carry out more attacks there, and then it's almost unanimously kind of agreed on that the nature of the disputed areas allows this, the ISIS to operate better. Does that, in your view, kind of push both sides of the Iraqi government and the Kurdish government, or to find a way to prevent? So what I'm asking here is that I'm not trying to attribute a positive thing to ISIS, but the next phase of ISIS, does that compel both governments to say, okay, we need to find a solution for this disputed areas?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think so, because for example, the government side is saying ISIS helped us expand our control into Kirkuk, for example, or these militias, not the government itself. But hopefully, the persistent presence of ISIS will get both sides to start cooperating. We saw probably some signs of that with the new government in Iraq, where they're trying to, with the help of the president, to reconcile between these two sides and kind of find a way to do that. But when it comes to ISIS, it did benefit from this sort of vacuum that usually exists when there's dispute over territory. So not just because of that, you have, like in Diyala, Salah ad-Din, and Kirkuk, you have this sort of resurgence of ISIS in some of these areas. Not just because of the dispute. That's one factor. The other factor is that ISIS had time to rebuild itself in those areas. Because in those areas ISIS was expelled a long time ago, it had more time to rebuild itself. And also ISIS has experience working in Iraq. That's why, according to the Pentagon report 2 months ago, ISIS is coming back, or kind of regenerating, growing faster in Iraq than in Syria, because Syria is still being liberated. So, and Syria, ISIS doesn't have the same networks as it had in Iraq, because it's an Iraqi organization more than it's a Syrian organization. Only expanded into Syria in 2013-14 through Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. And there's a third reason. If you think about what happened in Kirkuk and how ISIS started to grow and start to attack more regularly, it happened after the Iraqi government took over Kirkuk. Because when you expel one security force and replace it with another, what that does leaves gaps.
Right.
And ISIS kind of played on that, and that's why ISIS has been attacking more and more regularly since then in those areas. So imagine if, say, 1/3 of Syria, currently controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, would be taken over by Assad. That will create a gap, huge gaps, because the Syrian Democratic Forces at least know the area now. They have locals. The regime comes in, they have to learn everything from the beginning. But also because people don't like the Assad regime. They might not love the Syrian Democratic Forces, but at least they don't have the same problems they have with the Assad regime in those areas.
Right.
So the disruption is a problem.
Right. Thank you so much, Hassan
Thank you.
Hassan, Director of the Nonstate Actors Program at the Center for Global Studies. I very much enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching.